the beginning of how when God begins to explain or introduce or reveal these things to us is actually at Mount Sinai. And recorded for us in Exodus chapter 23. The people of Israel, some 3 million people approximately, have been redeemed up out of the land of Egypt in the house of bondage. And they've been brought together on eagle's wings of God to himself at Mount Sinai in the desert, as is written in chapter 19 of Exodus. And from that point, in chapter 19 through to chapter 24 of Exodus, we are in a literary unit of a covenant-making ceremony, a historical event where God offers a covenant to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he offers this to them because they are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that they are the promised miraculous seed promised to those fathers. And now, hundreds of years later, the promise of the covenant has began to come forth in that the seed into a family, into a nation, has now been redeemed from the house of slavery by God and are on their way to enter into or be brought by God into the land of promise, into the land of Canaan, to become the land of Israel as an eternal inheritance, as was promised by God to the fathers. Now, within that, there is this new covenant, this new offer that God is making to the descendants of that promise. Because they are the fulfillment of that covenant, they're going to be offered this new one. And this is the covenant of the Torah. All right, the Torah, how this scripture refers to itself as the teaching and instruction of God, wherein the main body of this covenant is described in 10 words, commonly known as the 10 Commandments. And then those 10 will be explained in more further detail and as the chapters continue to unfold. All right, so however, all of these instructions, they are all expressed as one commandment, as one teaching and instruction from God. That is an important element to understand, that they all are hanging on one principle, value, and that is the instruction to love God, to love him with all our being. And the question is, how do I love God? Well, the way in which I do so is through loving my neighbor as myself. But what if my neighbor lives as an enemy with me? He's my brother, he's my neighbor. We're of the same tribe, the same people, the same nation, same kingdom, same covenant, but he hates me and he's my enemy. So what do? Well, I seek to love him and regain my enemy from once again as my neighbor. Okay, so these things, these principles of the kingdom that God is giving to Israel here at this time is summarized in this one element of love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. But this word for love is particularly important in that it is a covenant word as it is understood in the Torah itself, in the Hebrew scriptures, meaning that it's not left to be interpreted or understood just however you like to interpret this word of love, and that surely there's all sorts of understandings, but specifically from within the context of the historical culture and language of the Torah itself, the word for love is found within the covenant context, meaning it's therefore defined by the covenant context. And what it means is essentially the action of doing what is good, what is for the benefit of the other person you're covenanted to or with. Okay, so your action towards another for their benefit and not for one's own. All right, so that summarizes all of this essential literary unit from Exodus chapter 19 to 24. All right, now within all of this, in chapter 23, that being the greater context, there is some detail here in chapter 23 that we want to focus on as to what does the covenanted life look like in regards to the agricultural activity within the land that will be given as an inheritance. All right, the land that is going to be for the covenanted, meaning you live in this land because you're covenanted to God, and therefore you live in this land in a certain covenanted manner. All right, I don't get to decide what that is. If I want to live there, this is the way in which the kingdom of God in this land is going to function for the benefit of all the people, not just the people of Israel within, but all the other nations within and around. Okay, because Israel will not be alone, obviously. So the purpose is to spread this this covenanted life and this wisdom for life of living with for the benefit of others, not just for myself, for that to spread throughout Israel and then throughout Israel, from Israel throughout the nations, so that the rule of God might spread over the nations. And what would characterize the rule of God will be this covenant love. All right. Again, it's not emphasizing the emotion as much as it's emphasizing the action. How will you behave? What will you do for your fellow man? All right. So within all of that, now focusing here in chapter 23, we're going to be introduced to agricultural activity that, within the land in such a way that is going to be an invitation from God. Verse 14 of Exodus chapter 23. Shalosh regalim tachog li b'shana. 3 times a year you are to celebrate a festival to me. That's how it is translated, but specifically this festival, okay, is a pilgrimage. It's a Hebrew word that comes from the word for a foot or a leg. Okay, so 3 times you're on your feet and you're going to walk from wherever you live. You're going to journey to specifically what we will learn later on is where God will cause his name to dwell. All right, so wherever you live, there you go. 3 times a year, you're going to celebrate this pilgrimage festival to me, God, in the year. All right, so already within this covenant context, we start to learn that there is a covenant year, a way that you are walking through the year together as a community, as a people, that is truly significant. All right, and then he introduces what are those 3 times. It begins with the pilgrimage festival of unleavened bread. All right, and that was the Passover, which we explored before. In verse 16, we read, "V'chag hakatzir b'kurei ma'asecha, asher tizra b'sadeh, v'chag ha'asif b'tzet hashana." So here you have 2, all in one verse. Celebrate the festival of harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in your field. Celebrate the festival of ingathering at the end of the year. So those are 2 different festivals, okay? So all together in these 2 verses, we have 3. The first one is the Passover, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where in the land you're harvesting the barley harvest, okay? All right, and so then that would be earlier a few weeks ago. And now the second harvest, between the 2, you're actually watching the next harvest. And that is going to be the wheat. Right? And so that's what is referred to here in verse 16, celebrate the harvest essentially of the wheat, right? Or the first fruits of the crops that you sow in the field. And then the second half of that verse, celebrate the festival of ingathering at the end of the year. That's going to be in the 7th month of the Hebrew calendar. Harvesting of all the different fruits of the trees, whether it's the pomegranate, the figs and the dates and the olives, spread out over a period of a few months, yes, but those are the other kinds of harvest that you will have in the land. And that's going to be the festival of the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, okay? So those are the 3 harvest festivals of the land. And we have to appreciate how the instructions of God are intimately linked to the land itself, the characteristic of the geography, the climate, the different kinds of food that are going to be growing naturally there, and how people will engage with that. And what do you do? Okay, so when you harvest your field, you have your first fruits. What do you do with that? Okay, so continuing to read verse 17, 3 times a year, all the men are to appear before the sovereign Lord. Do not offer the blood of a sacrifice to me, along with anything containing yeast. All right, so this already begins to be something of a question as to why does God have specific instruction of sacrifice? Okay, well, let's begin with a little bit with verse 17. 3 times a year, I want to see all your men. All right, well, does that mean he doesn't care about seeing all the women? No, okay, that would be, I think, a misguided understanding. The men, as the head of the households, they are to take the responsibility of taking their household on this sacred pilgrimage, wherever they live, to come to where God's name will dwell, where he will dwell amongst his people, and where you bring your harvest, or your first fruits. And so you have to take that responsibility to organize your family and come and to do this. Okay, so the men represent their family. So that is why there is this emphasis here. 3 times a year, I want to see all your men, meaning all of you, basically, is what is being emphasized. All right, so there can be a much more discussion on that point, but that is a simple reading of it. From that instruction, you see the Lord of all the land, okay? Hadon, the Lord. And therefore you're going to bring sacrifice because you're coming before the Lord. Well, this word for sacrifice, right, in Hebrew it's zevach, and zevach comes from the word for mizbeach, which means altar. Okay, so you're coming to the altar, and there you bring your sacrifice. And so we're to understand that this bringing of the first fruits to the house of the Lord is to be within the context of worship. And that in the ancient Near East, when you talk about worship, what goes through your mind? It's a really, really valid question, actually. I mean, for all of us to ask ourselves, when I speak about worship, what do I mean? What is my presupposition as to what I expect you to understand of me when we're talking about worship, or what I think that you understand, or what I think that you mean when you're talking to me? Okay, when we talk about worship, what do we understand by it? And so worship in the ancient Near Eastern context, specifically as it's described in the Bible, the word of God to Israel, and through the culture of Israel, well, worship is coming to an altar. And an altar is for bringing a sacrifice to the altar. And sacrifice is facilitating the acts of worship. Now, as we read later in Scripture, there is going to be a Levitical choir around the altar that facilitates the singing of psalms and music. And therefore, as we're going to see how these are times of celebration. Therefore, we can assume that the choir is leading the people in song and in dance, and but this in the environment of the altar, in the environment of the house of the Lord. And so worship is beginning at the altar and then radiating out from there all sorts of activities that are really quite important. Therefore, we have to engage with this question: why does worship have to associate with sacrifice? Sacrifice, it feels, I don't know about you, but to how I hear people expression of sacrifice, either they don't like the notion, it's something that I have to let go of, and why do you require me to just sacrifice or whatever? Uh, and then when I get a little bit more closely to listen to people's referring to biblical sacrifice, well, that's something of the Old Testament that was really bloody and really grotesque and barbaric. And thank God, God is no longer like that. All right, so we don't need to engage with all those bloody sacrifices of the Old Testament. And I mean bloody in the literal sense, and some people talk about it in the British sense as well. So this is a real issue in that God is inviting all the people, and he wants to see them 3 times a year. I want to see you, is what he is saying to Israel here. Wherever you live, come to my presence 3 times a year. And when you come, engage with sacrifice. Okay, but sacrifice, if we understand it in the context of ancient Israel. Well, let's read another verse. It might help us to understand. Okay, he says, "Do not sacrifice anything containing yeast. The fat of my festival offerings must not be kept until morning. And then bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord." Okay, so all right, there's to be no yeast, and this we'll leave for a little bit later. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But the fat is emphasized here, and that the fat. I don't know if any of you like to do a barbecue, or if any of you like to grill some good meat or put it on the pan. If you are a vegetarian or vegan, I guess you won't understand this conversation as much, because the fat on the grill, the fat on the whatever it is, however you're going to be preparing this meat, is where it becomes tender and sweet and yummy. Don't forget all the things about health for a moment, okay? The fat is the sweet stuff, the good stuff. It's the prized stuff. And there's many cultures who will understand and speak in this manner. And here God is speaking to Israel All right. The fat of my festival must not be kept until morning. Now, I don't know what he means by that, but what I hear is it is to be consumed all and at one time. And this night, day and night, let the festival be good. Let it last and let it be consumed. And don't let it last until the next day. Focus on the now and let it be tangibly enjoyed right now. And this specifically is what is put on the altar. Okay, meaning the people are going to be engaging with this sacrifice, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But the fat is that portion is for God. That is on the altar, and that's what He is consuming. Meaning, the altar is a table. The table is where we sit down to eat, right? And as a family, we can understand how much love is expressed and communicated in the family, particularly through the labor and the efforts of the mother. But hey, I know a lot of fathers and men who are good chefs, not me to the dismay of my wife, but there's a lot of men who engage with this more so. But okay, for traditionally, for so many cultures, including for Israel, the mother engaging with this activity of food at the table is a language of love and provision. And so now we're talking about the altar as God's table where He's inviting His people to come. 3 times a year, I want to see you sitting at my table, at the altar, and let the fat not last till morning, okay? Enjoy it all this night, and that's my portion. That's what I, God, am going to be eating. You're going to be giving that to me. But, well, it's not just the fat. He wants you to bring the best of the first fruits of your soil. Meaning when you have your harvest and you look at all that you have gathered together, well, here comes the first test. And here is where we start to think about sacrifice a little bit more. And that is, well, you start to understand that the first fruits, well, you give them to God. Because, well, indeed, you did the work of breaking the soil, seeding the seed, and irrigation, and the sweat of harvest, especially if it's 35 degrees out here, okay? It's a lot of work, a lot of effort. So why should I give any of this to somebody else, particularly to God? Well, it's a recognition that although I did this work, I did not bring the rain. I depend on that critical element of the rain. I don't live in other lands where there's flowing rivers like Egypt or whatever. No, the rain is God's participation. He watches over the land and He sends rain in its season, in the right kind of rain at the right time. And in that throughout the rain season, basically Israel has 2 seasons, a dry season and a wet season. And there's specific different types of rain in the beginning, the early rains, and then the latter rains. There are different types of rain, okay? And that's God's part in this, okay? He's bringing the rain. And more so, I seeded the soil, but I couldn't make the soil give forth. I prepared it, cleared away the rocks and thorns, but I couldn't make it give its fruit. That is God's work. And so therefore, I recognize God is the one who is working with me and giving me this harvest. Yes, I have to seed and I have to harvest, but He deserves the first fruits because He is the one who brought the rain. He is the one who brought the multiplication of the seed. Did I know that if it was going to multiply 30%, 60%, 100%? You can hear an echo of different parables in that, okay? So the first fruits, therefore, is particularly important, and He wants you to bring the best. And here comes in this important element. You give to God what belongs to Him. It's a partnership. And you get, and what belongs to Him? The best of the first fruit. Okay, you don't give Him the bits that are not as good. It's a little smaller. It's dried up a little bit. It doesn't look so great. No. You look and you see what is the prime of your harvest, and that is what you're giving to God. And then within that context, now we understand sacrifice. That you understand you have to let go of something. But the question is well, just like you took the seed and you put it in the soil, that was a letting go. All right. Essentially, you want to eat that seed. You want to grind it into flour and make bread. That's food for your family. And now you're letting it go. You're throwing it into the earth. It's like you're throwing it away. But you are with good hope and faith that it's going to come back to you, multiplied, right? That is the principle of sacrifice. If you don't let it go, then you have no delayed gratification. And therefore, you just want to eat it now, but then you have no assurance or security for food for your family for next year. And so through the principle of sacrifice, we understand that we delay our gratification and we have this agreement with the soil in a sense. But no, it's a covenanted life with God. You live according to the principles of this covenant. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then you'll know that we will know how you love God. And within this covenant, God promises, I will send you the rain in abundance. I will multiply your harvest in abundance. That's the partnership. And therefore, we're giving it back. And it is therefore really testing our understanding that if I do not sacrifice, I don't have a harvest. It's that simple. All right, so therefore, I'm taking the celebration of that faith, because now I have this harvest, and I'm going to give the portion that belongs to God. I'm giving it back to Him, all right, by bringing my family into His house. And now, one more element before I go to another passage here. All right, so remember, this is happening 3 times a year: the Passover, all right, the what will become known as the Pentecost, the Shavuot, and the Tabernacles. Okay, we'll see those names in a bit. So this is what I'm describing 3 times a year. When you have a harvest, you're going to bring it into God's house, and you bring Him the best. All right, and that is your celebration of how your faith has not let you down, because God's faithfulness, as He's covenanted to us, He hasn't let us down. All right, and that gives a confidence for next year as well. And within that, we have this strange sentence. Verse 19, as we read, bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God. And then he says, do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Now, that statement is going to be repeated 3 times in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah itself, in the writings of Moses. And it's because of that sentence that, if you know observant Jews, Orthodox Jews today, they do not mix meat and dairy as a result of that statement, okay, in the scripture. They don't have a cheeseburger, all right? So they have a separation, all right? But when we come back to this statement and we observe it within its context, as it is here within the setting of a pilgrimage celebration coming to God's house, well, we start to understand it within the context of a great feast. And at a great feast, when you're bringing the animals that you're going to be feasting on, whether it's from the flocks or from the herds, and you bring them to the altar, right? I mean, you're going to kill these animals. But if you don't kill these animals, you have nothing to feast on, all right? And so the principle is, when you have so many people gathered together, don't kill both the mother and the baby. Right? Don't kill 2 generations. Right? Do not boil a young kid, a baby goat, in its mother's milk within the fat of the mother. That's another way in which we can read and understand that statement. Meaning, to get the fat of the mother, you have to kill both generations. All right. So God is saying, do not wipe out the herds and the flocks. You have to keep them alive for the next season, right? And that's what shepherds do. That's the shepherding culture. Right? So that's one way in which it can be understood. Right? A lot would disagree with what I just said, so you can explore it yourself. So this is how we are introduced to this principle within the context of covenant at Mount Sinai, where God is inviting all His people to come and bring their harvest as a first fruits. Now, I want to now move to Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, we have a repetition of this this covenant that is being made at Mount Sinai, but 40 years later. All right, a new generation is born in the desert. They're getting ready to enter into the land of Canaan. They're just across the river Jordan, and they're so eager to enter into the land and to begin their lives. But now Moses has gathered them together, and he's renewing the covenant with this new generation, reminding them how to live in the land. And so that's the whole of the book of Deuteronomy. It's a covenant renewal before the people of Israel enter. And move with me to chapter 14 now. In verse 22, we have a further explanation of what was introduced to us in Exodus chapter 23. And this is really quite important for us to appreciate the spirit of these pilgrimage festivals, that Pentecost is the second of which. That is our focus for today, right? Aser ta'asor, tithe a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. All right, all that you've seeded each year, take a tenth of that. Meaning, how do I know what is the first fruits? How much am I actually going to bring? Well, I calculate all of my harvest and I take the first tenth. That is my first fruits. I'm going to bring, once again, the best of what I have harvested. And so I am to tithe that to God. This is actually where the biblical tithe is coming from, that people talk a lot about and apply it in various different ways. But here in Deuteronomy 14 is where it all comes from. Okay, so these verses from verse 22 to the end of the chapter. So the tithe that you're going to give to God, verse 23, "V'achalta lifnei Adonai Elohecha b'makom asher yivchar lishakem shmo sham." V'achalta, and you are to eat it before the Lord your God. Well, stop there already. This is quite the statement. All right, you are going to eat it. Well, how do I give to God this tithe? In a remarkable way, God is inviting us to his house and he's telling us, you are eating it. You are to eat it. But where? You cannot just stay home and eat it. You have to give it to God. You have to come to where he causes, as it says here, to cause his name to dwell there. Now, eventually, that's going to become chosen by God to be in Jerusalem. Right? That's in the lives of David and Solomon, because of the binding of Isaac. All right, so that's a whole nother story. So Jerusalem will be the place where he will choose his mountain to make it his holy mountain, where he causes his name to dwell there, and gathering all of Israel there to his house. And there you are to bring your tithe, your tenth, and there you give it to God. But you're at his table, you're at his altar. And now specifically we read in Deuteronomy, "Ve'achalta," and you are to eat it before the Lord your God, in the presence of God's name. Now that's a whole other conversation that we should have, but I don't think we'll take the time right now to have that conversation, but you have to pursue, what does it mean for the name of God to dwell somewhere? If you think about it, that's a strange statement. Well, but simply put, without going into detail, a name is a reputation. Okay, who are you? What are you like? How do people experience you? Okay, we all have a name. As, thankfully, in our Hebrew culture, our names, well, you can hear the meanings. You don't just hear Yoel or as Joel, my name. No, you hear the Lord is God. The name Yo is God. Right? It's a declaration. You hear the meaning, the declaration. So also we come back to God's name. What is the meaning of his name? What is it that people were to hear? And as a reputation, how do people experience God? And once again, we have the revelation of Mount Sinai, Exodus chapter 34. El Rachum L'Chanun, Erech Apaim. God who is compassionate, who is gracious, who is long-suffering, meaning he's very patient with all of our nonsense. And he is abounding in covenant faithfulness, loving kindness, and he's true. These are the attributes of God that is given all in one breath, that is the way in which he is to be experienced. And we can go much more in this. So essentially, will you cause those attributes, that the characteristics of God's name in God's people, all right? People are to live in the way in which God is, his character. Meaning when you live in the character of God, his attributes are describing your character. Meaning when you live in compassion and in grace and in faithfulness to one another and with a patience and so forth. When truth is your character, what you say and what you do, the name of God becomes tangibly visible. And there we behold his glory. All right. And so that is the name of God dwelling in Jerusalem. And again, that's only a beginning of a lengthy conversation. But there is where we are to bring our harvest 3 times a year: Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, where we bring the first fruits, the tenth of the best fruits, and you come to God's house, you come to where God's name is, and there you eat it. And he goes into detail here, right? The grain, the new wine, and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks, in the presence of the Lord your God. When I read the NIV, it says, eat the tithe. All right. So just once again, I want to just emphasize that. Who is eating it? This is part of what this passage is revealing to us. All right. So all the different kinds of harvest that you have, you bring it and you eat it in his presence, all together with all of Israel and all from the nations who want to cleave to the God of Israel by binding themselves with the people of God. So there in his presence of the Lord your God at the place where he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that in this next statement, this last part of verse 23 is where we learn why. Why does God want us to tithe? Why does he want us to eat the tithe in his presence? This last statement is so amazing to me. So that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. Okay, leman tilmad lira'ah et Adonai Elohecha kol hayamim. All your days, not just always, all your days that you live, you're going to, well, it translated here in NIV, revere. I do like that. But the word, it's a translation of this idiom, yirat Adonai, the fear of the Lord that we're familiar with in Scripture. Now, this here is quite important in that we're not to understand fear in the sense of I'm afraid of God. That is another expression. Rather, the fear of, and then you put the name of whatever deity you're fearing, it means to worship. Who is it that you worship? If you worship Baal, well, that you fear him. If you worship Allah, you fear him. Okay, well, here we're talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. That is my name for all generations, as God says to Moses at the burning bush, Exodus chapter 3. That's my name, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's my name for all generations. Well, fear the name of the Lord, meaning worship the name of the Lord. Who do you choose to serve and to worship? How do you worship? Well, that's an important question. Well, it begins at the altar. And at the altar is where you learn to worship him, to serve him, and you choose this God over all the other gods that are possible or available to you. You choose this one over all the rest. Why? Why do I choose this one? Well, at the altar is where I learn that to make this choice. How? What is the environment of the altar? It is this great feast at God's table, right? I've given him the tithe. I've given him the first fruits, the best of my harvest, of all the different kinds of harvests. Not just me, but all the people of God. We've all gathered together from all the ends of the land, and we see each other therefore 3 times a year. How fun is that? You can imagine the children growing up playing with each other in this way, and how sad it is to depart, but you're going to see each other again, and you grow up together. And so also, all the tribes, we are experiencing the family throughout all the tribes, and we are raising our children together, and we are raising our own maturity spiritually with one another in the house of the Lord at his altar, and in the environment of feasting at God's table. All right, this is something really amazing, and it's described in a bit more detail in the next verse. All right, but if the place is too distant, this is verse 24, and you have been blessed by the Lord your God and can't carry your tithe, meaning your harvest is like so big, you've been blessed with such a great harvest and you can't carry it all the way. Well, what do? Well, you exchange it for money. All right, then you exchange your tithe for silver and take the silver with you and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. All right, that will eventually be Jerusalem. Then once you get to Jerusalem, use the silver to buy whatever you like. This is verse 26. Sheep, wine, other fermented drink, that's probably beer, or anything you wish. Then you and your household, meaning you're asking your children, do you like lamb? Let's eat lamb. Do you like beef? Let's eat beef. What do you want, my love? Let's use this silver that we have as a result of exchanging the first fruits that the Lord has blessed us with. And now that we've journeyed from the Galilee all the way to Jerusalem, let's buy whatever we want. Okay? And now, whatever you want, let's do this. And so, whatever it is that you want to eat, let's eat. All right? Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God with all of the great joy that we experience as people at a great feast, or this divine barbecue. I like to think of it. At God's table, whatever we love to eat, that is what we buy from the money of this tithe, the tenth that we're giving to God. So it's not the Father buying for the family, it's the Heavenly Father buying for all of the family, right? We're at his table, it belongs to him. So he is the one buying for us whatever we love to eat and drink together, to celebrate together in his presence, in his house. Friends, this is a solution to a question that we hear so often everywhere, doesn't matter where. And that is, how do you raise up the next generation to want to worship the Lord and prevent the tragedy of, when I die, I don't think my children will continue to worship God after me. Once I die, they feel free to do whatever they want to do. It's Papa's religion. It's not my religion. It's not my faith. Well, no, this passage here in Deuteronomy, built on Mount Sinai, Exodus chapter 23, here is where God is teaching us, how will you teach your children to want to choose to worship the living God all their days? It's in the context of this feast and celebration at God's table, 3 times a year at the harvest festivals: Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles. So what we're describing here is not true. It's true not only of Pentecost. It's true also of the others. But this is essential, fundamental context to understand what is the Pentecost. It's a harvest festival, and it is where we're going to then take a holy pilgrimage into the house of God. And there, together with all the rest of God's people, we're feasting at his table. And that joy, you smell the roasting of the meat on the flames of the altar, right? And you just delight yourself in every bite of the yumminess of that food and all the fruit and the wonderful drink that you enjoy. And together with the music of the Levitical choir, where you have the songs of the Psalms where we are singing and dancing, and you have the whole orchestra, right? You have all these instruments in the presence of all of Israel. This is worship at the altar. All right. So whenever you're reading what seems to be a description in the Old Testament of, well, so many animals that are being killed for the ritual of worship at the altar, and you think, oh, it's so bloody. Get rid of that. No. Try to engage with the biblical culture. People didn't hardly eat meat throughout the year. These 3 times of the year is where, well, people will be eating meat in such a wonderful way. Imagine that. Unless you are very wealthy, then maybe indeed you'll eat meat more often. But otherwise, mostly, people are not going to kill their animals. They depend on their animals. All right, that's the statement. Don't kill both generations, not mother and baby. No, you have to be wise with how you do this. So imagine today we eat so many more animals today than Israel ever did. We have to keep this in perspective. We eat it 3 times a day. They ate 3 times a year, maybe, the Passover, the Pentecost, and the Tabernacles, in the setting in which there is great joy, and through that joy, I'd make the choice. I love this God so much. Look at all of the goodness. Now, it's not just the blessing of prosperity. It's the blessing of all of how good and how pleasant it is for brothers of the tribes to dwell together, all together. It is that human contact and relationship. You part your ways, but then you come back together 3 times a year, and you that celebration of sharing life with one another, that you do so together with the living God, our God. And in this way, why would I ever want to choose any other deity that I shape and form with my own hands in my own likeness. No, this is the way in which God is giving us this solution. How do you teach the next generation to want to choose to worship the living God, right? And so, however, what if you don't have a harvest? There was plenty in Israel who wouldn't have a harvest. And that's the conclusion of these verses here. Verse 26, then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord, Jerusalem, your God, and rejoice. V'samachta ata uveitecha, you and your household rejoice. And continuing to verse 27, and do not, when you're rejoicing and you're feasting, do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment of inheritance of their own. If you remember, the tribe of Levi was given the Lord as their inheritance. They would become the priestly tribe, meaning they are facilitating worship in the house of God and distributed throughout the land, throughout the tribes, so to continue to instruct the worship of God throughout the rest of the year. But not in that there is sacrifice on altars throughout the land throughout the year, no. If you want to worship at an altar, you cannot do that anywhere outside of God's presence. If you do so, according to the instructions in the Torah, if you kill an animal for worship outside of the presence of God, its blood is on your head. That's a really heavy statement. Its blood is on your head, meaning you've murdered this animal, and that's unacceptable. If you kill an animal for worship outside the presence of its creator, meaning it's very solemn at the same time. And if without that seriousness, you have no rejoicing. There's great cost. It's cost of life that is facilitating then this great rejoicing of our human interactions with one another in the presence of God. So the Levites are spread throughout the land as the Lord is their inheritance, and they don't have a harvest therefore. So you don't abandon them, okay? You bring them with you. Right? They are your teachers. They are your Levites. They are helping you, instructing you, serving you. You bring them with you, and you bring them together with the foreigner. Okay, but continuing on in verse 28, at the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store in your towns, so that the Levites, those who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widow. These are the four categories of people who would be more vulnerable in the society. Maybe they don't have a harvest. So who do they depend on? They depend on God as their father, not on all of us. We put our tithe into his storerooms, and they don't come knocking on my door begging for money. No, they maintain their dignity as we are equal brothers. They go to their father's house to eat at his table. All right, they're not. They're not begging. Right? If I don't have an inheritance, I don't lose my dignity in the eyes of my neighbor, my brother. I go to my father and I eat at his house, and in the storerooms distributed throughout the land. And in this way, the tithe every third year you put into the storerooms, so that all who are vulnerable, right? Well, you take them with you on your annual celebration, okay, in God's house, such as the Pentecost. You bring them with you to celebrate with you, but otherwise, throughout the rest of the year, they're depending on God. So you must put your tithe on that third year into his storeroom, so that there is the money, there is the food for them to continue to eat when they don't have this harvest. So that's this description in Deuteronomy. And I hope you can appreciate why I'm going at length in this description, because this is the fabric of the pilgrimage feast. It's true for all three of them, but we're focusing on the Pentecost. And so if we don't have Exodus chapter 23, I want to see you 3 times a year. If we don't have Deuteronomy 14 describing this feasting and celebration and the joy of worship in the house of God, by which we learn to choose God, well, then we miss the spirit of what it is about. All right. So I hope that you can appreciate this backdrop for the Pentecost. So let's now go to Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23. And here in Leviticus, we have now a description of the whole sacred calendar, the whole movement of time throughout the year, where we are going to have these festivals. I don't really want to call it festivals, that it is not a good enough translation, but it communicates in English. But more literally, as we read here, excuse me, in verse 23, Leviticus chapter 23, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe le'emor, daber el bnei Israel, speak to the children of Israel, v'amart alehem, and you say to them, Mo'edei Hashem asher tikra'u otam mikra'ei kodesh." The appointed times was translated as appointed feasts, okay? It's more literally, or appointed festivals, literally, appointed times, okay? The appointed times of the Lord, that you are to proclaim them as holy, or you are to proclaim them as holy gatherings. All right. Elohim Mo'adai. These are my appointed times. It's repeated twice in one verse, verse 2. And therefore, it's inaccurate to describe these in the way in which we often hear people describing these as the Jewish feasts. Well, that is a historically true statement because only the Jewish people have been doing these things. Therefore, the feast of Israel, the Jewish feasts, yes, but no, actually, biblically, that is not really an accurate statement. It's a true statement historically, but not biblically. In that biblically, as they are introduced by God to Israel, here in verse 2, they belong to God. Okay, they are the appointed times of the Lord. They belong to Him, to the Master of the universe. And that when He created the universe, when He created the sun, moon, the stars in creation, day 4 in Genesis chapter 1, this is the first time we see that word appearing. All right. Why does He create the sun, moon, and stars? Well, for signs and for appointed times, for days and years and such. So you have the measurement of the movement of time, but within the movement of time, you have appointed times, not just seasons, but what the times in which we have God setting holy days, holy festivals, where He invites us into His presence at His altar, and that He is with us throughout the year. Indeed, that is one of the elements of His name. He is forever and always with us. But there are certain times throughout the year where He is inviting us to enter into His presence in Jerusalem, in His house, together with all of Israel, as holy convocations. There are appointed times where we gather in to see the face of God in a tangible way where His name is dwelling. This is really important to appreciate. They don't belong to Israel. They belong to God, and they are His invitations to His people for them to enter His presence. How are the nations to hear these invitations is by what God says to Israel here. These are my appointed times that you are to proclaim. Well, if all Israel is to receive this and proclaim it, who are we to proclaim it to? To one another? Yes, so say the sages of Israel. But not only. Yes, we proclaim to each other, it's the appointed time. Let's go to Jerusalem. Let's feast in the house of the Lord. Yes, hallelujah. But not only to each other. That declaration, that the pronouncement of this sacred time is then to echo through to the nations, okay, in a way that is going to be truly profound, so that by the time you come to the prophets, such as Isaiah and Ezekiel and Zechariah, we find, for just a few examples, we find where that God is inviting all the nations, they're going to gather together, such as in Isaiah 56, where all from the nations who love the name of the Lord, who love His Sabbath and love His name, they're going to come to His altar, into the house of prayer for all nations. Okay? Well, when? Well, for example, in Zechariah in chapter 14, for example, on the Tabernacles, for example, all the nations are going to come and they're going to celebrate, and they're going to worship. All right? So you can read those two passages. It's so wonderful. And it begins here in Leviticus chapter 23, where Israel are to pronounce them and declare them, to announce to each other and to the nations these eternal appointed times. They don't belong to Israel alone. They were set in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the sun, moon, and stars, and therefore they belong to all who are under the sun, moon, and stars, to this invitation to come into the presence of the Creator, the Master of the universe, and our Father.